The first thing I saw that Tuesday morning wasn't my truck. It was a wall of fresh concrete stretching across the end of my driveway like somebody had decided, sometime between midnight and sunrise, that my home no longer needed an exit. I just stood there holding a coffee mug that suddenly felt a whole lot heavier than it should have, staring at steam rising off concrete that hadn't even finished curing yet. And the strangest part wasn't that somebody had poured it there. It was that they honestly believed I'd wake up, shrug my shoulders, and accept it. Looking back now, I think that was the exact moment this stopped being about a sidewalk and turned into a fight over who believed they owned my property more than I did. My name is Ethan Walker, and until all this happened, I was probably the least interesting guy in our neighborhood outside of Franklin Ridge. I'm 46, work as a commercial HVAC technician, spend most weekends fixing things that don't really need fixing, and if you ask my wife, Claire, she'll tell you I've never met a broken lawnmower I wasn't convinced I could bring back to life. We moved into the neighborhood almost 8 years earlier because it seemed peaceful. Tree-lined streets, kids riding bicycles, neighbors waving while walking their dogs, the kind of place where people actually remembered your birthday and borrowed ladders instead of pretending not to know your name. Sure, there was an HOA, but I figured it handled landscaping, snow removal, and making sure nobody painted their garage neon green. I wasn't looking for trouble, and honestly, trouble never seemed interested in me either. The house itself sat on a corner lot with a slightly wider driveway than most of the others. Before we bought it, I paid for an independent survey because I had plans to build a detached workshop one day, and that's when I learned something important. The driveway, from the sidewalk all the way to my garage, was entirely on my property. There wasn't a shared access agreement, no public easement, no language giving the association authority to alter it. I filed every document neatly into a folder and forgot about it because, well, why wouldn't I? Nobody expects to defend a driveway. Things started changing when the HOA elected a new board president named Richard Nolan. Richard had one of those smiles that always looked rehearsed, like he practiced it in a mirror before meetings. He loved talking about property values, community image, and modernization. Every sentence sounded like a campaign speech, even though nobody was running for office anymore. At first, most people liked him because he actually got projects moving after years of delays. Flower beds were replaced, playground equipment was upgraded, entrance signs were repainted. Then the project started getting bigger, and so did Richard's confidence. Somewhere along the way, he stopped asking homeowners what they thought and started telling them what was going to happen. At one monthly meeting, he rolled out plans for what he proudly called the Franklin Ridge Walkability Initiative. According to him, extending sidewalks through several sections of the neighborhood would improve safety, increase home values, and create a more unified appearance. Most people clapped. It sounded reasonable. Then I looked closer at the drawings. The proposed sidewalk extension crossed directly over the lower edge of my driveway. I raised my hand and asked if that section had been reviewed against private property surveys. Richard barely glanced at the map before saying, "Our engineering consultant handled everything." I replied, "I'd still like somebody to compare it with my recorded survey because that concrete would be on my land." He smiled that same polished smile and said, "We'll take a look." A week later, nobody had called, so I emailed the board copies of my survey, deed, and county plat map. I kept the message polite. I explained that I wasn't against the sidewalk project. If adjustments needed to be made, I'd gladly cooperate. I simply wanted them to avoid pouring concrete on private property. 2 days later, Richard answered with exactly 3 sentences. "The project has been approved. The association has authority to complete neighborhood improvements. We appreciate your cooperation." That last sentence bothered me the most because I hadn't agreed to anything. Claire read the email over dinner, looked up at me, and said, "That doesn't sound like cooperation. That sounds like they already made up their minds." She was right, but I still believed common sense would eventually win. I even drove to the contractor's office one afternoon and spoke with the project supervisor. He seemed surprised when I showed him the survey and admitted he hadn't been given individual property documents. He promised he'd ask the HOA for clarification before touching my driveway. I remember driving home feeling relieved. Misunderstandings happen. People communicate. Problems get solved. That's how adults are supposed to operate. Except 3 weeks passed in complete silence. Construction began farther down the street. Crews poured sidewalks section by section. And every evening I'd come home expecting someone from the board to knock on my door. Nobody ever did. Then came Monday night. Around 9 o'clock, I heard heavy equipment somewhere outside. But roadwork had been going on for days, so I didn't think much of it. We watched half a movie, went to bed, and slept through the rest. At 6 the next morning, I grabbed my coffee, hit the garage opener, and climbed into my truck for work. The garage door rolled up, and there it was. Fresh gray concrete stretched from one side of my property to the other, tied seamlessly into the new sidewalk as though my driveway had never existed. Tire tracks stopped inches from the wet surface. There were no warning signs, no barricades, no workers, no permit posted anywhere. Just silence, and a brand new slab of concrete telling me I wasn't driving anywhere that morning. I wish I could tell you I marched straight outside, started yelling, and gave everybody the kind of speech people remember for years. But that's not what happened. I just sat there behind the steering wheel with the engine idling, staring at that strip of wet concrete while my coffee slowly cooled in the cup holder. Claire stepped into the garage a minute later, looked past the truck, and whispered, "They actually did it." I nodded without saying anything because I already knew something she didn't. The second I lost my temper, Richard would win. He'd paint me as the angry homeowner who couldn't accept progress, and somehow this would become my fault instead of theirs. So I shut the truck off, walked back inside, grabbed my phone, and started documenting everything. Every angle, every measurement, every footprint still visible around the edges. The tire marks from the concrete truck, the lack of warning signs, the absence of permit information. I photographed it all with timestamps automatically attached. Then I switched to video, slowly narrating exactly what I was looking at, making sure the date and time appeared on my watch before panning across the driveway. It felt ridiculous in the moment, almost like I was filming a nature documentary about cement. But years working around construction had taught me one thing: memories fade, evidence doesn't. My first call wasn't to the HOA, it was to the county building office. The woman who answered sounded half asleep until I gave her my address. She put me on hold for less than 2 minutes before coming back. "Sir," she said, "I'm not showing any active permit for concrete work at that location." I asked her to check again. She did. Same answer. If work was performed on private property, we have no record of authorization. That sentence settled something inside me. This wasn't a disagreement anymore. It was a documented mistake, maybe even something worse. By 8 o'clock, I'd emailed every photograph to myself, backed them up in cloud storage, and printed hard copies before driving Claire's SUV to work since my truck was effectively imprisoned inside the garage. My coworkers noticed I wasn't exactly myself. During lunch, my friend Marcus looked across the table and said, "You planning on smiling sometime this week? Or should we be concerned?" I handed him my phone. He scrolled through the pictures, blinked twice, then laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was unbelievable. "They poured concrete across your driveway?" he asked. "Overnight?" I nodded. "Buddy, somebody's about to have an expensive week." That afternoon, I finally called Richard. He answered on the second ring, sounding almost cheerful. "Ethan," he said, "I figured you'd call. I asked one question. Why is there concrete on my property?" He sighed dramatically, the way people do when they want everyone listening to know they're dealing with an unreasonable person. "The project is finished," he replied. "The neighborhood looks fantastic." "That wasn't my question. Your driveway transition needed to match the sidewalk. You blocked my garage, temporarily, without permission." Another sigh. "Sometimes improvements require inconvenience." I remember gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. Then he added the sentence that changed everything. "The concrete's already cured enough that nothing's going to change now. I think it's best if you accept the outcome." Accept the outcome. As though ownership worked like a weather forecast. I took one slow breath and answered, "Richard, you'll receive a certified letter before tomorrow afternoon. You'll have 72 hours to remove every inch of concrete placed on my property." He chuckled. Actually chuckled. "Good luck with that." The line went dead. Claire found me sitting at the kitchen table drafting the letter by hand before typing the final version. She asked if I wanted our attorney involved immediately. I shook my head. "Not yet. First, I want them to have the opportunity to fix their own mistake." We mailed the letter certified that evening with delivery confirmation. It included copies of the survey, county records, photographs, and a clear deadline. Remove the unauthorized concrete within 72 hours, or I would arrange removal myself and seek recovery of every related expense. There wasn't a single insult anywhere in those pages, just facts. Waiting turned out to be the hardest part. Every morning I walked outside hoping to see construction equipment parked in front of the house. Every afternoon I came home to the exact same slab. Neighbors began stopping while walking their dogs. Some quietly admitted they thought the HOA had gone too far. Others avoided eye contact completely, probably worried they'd somehow get dragged into the argument. One elderly neighbor named Mrs. Delgado surprised me by bringing over a plate of homemade cookies. She'd lived there longer than almost anyone else. As she handed me the container, she smiled sadly and said, "Honey, organizations don't become dangerous because they have rules. They become dangerous when the people making them stop hearing the word no." I never forgot that. The 72 hours expired on a Friday afternoon at exactly 4 o'clock. Nothing happened. No apology. No contractor. No phone call. At 4:15, my phone rang anyway. It was Richard. "Just checking," he said with unmistakable sarcasm. "Is the world still spinning?" I replied, "Yes. And tomorrow morning it'll keep spinning while my contractor removes your concrete." Silence. Then he laughed again. "You won't find anyone willing to touch association property. It's not association property. We'll see." He hung up before I could answer. What Richard didn't know was that I'd spent those 3 days making arrangements. Not angry arrangements. Professional ones. I met with a licensed concrete cutting company that specialized in precision removal around utility lines. I hired an independent structural contractor to inspect the work afterward and verify no damage occurred beyond my property boundary. I also filed a complaint with county code enforcement, attaching every photograph, every email, every certified receipt, and the county's own confirmation that no permit existed. By the time Friday evening arrived, everyone who needed to know already knew. Around sunset, I walked outside one last time. The concrete had fully cured now, smooth and pale beneath the fading light. Richard probably believed time had solved his problem. After all, people get tired. They compromise. They tell themselves it's not worth the fight. Standing there, I realized he had completely misunderstood me. This had never been about concrete. It wasn't even about access to my garage anymore. It was about the simple idea that if somebody with enough confidence ignores your rights long enough, eventually you'll question whether those rights ever existed at all. I wasn't willing to let that happen. Not for a driveway, not for my family, and certainly not for every neighbor quietly watching to see what happened next. Before heading inside, I looked down the empty street and noticed the faint glow of headlights turning into the subdivision. 2 flatbed trucks rolled slowly past my house before continuing toward the community entrance, where they parked for the night. My contractor had called earlier to tell me they'd arrive before sunrise to avoid traffic. As I watched those trucks disappear into the darkness, I couldn't help smiling for the first time all week, because while Richard believed the story had ended with wet concrete, mine was just about to begin. The next morning, my alarm went off at 5, though I was already awake. I poured a cup of coffee, stepped onto the front porch, and listened to that strange silence neighborhoods have before sunrise, the kind where every sound carries a little farther than usual. At exactly 6 o'clock, 2 white work trucks turned the corner, followed by a trailer carrying a concrete saw, large enough to make it very clear these guys weren't there to argue with anybody. The crew leader, a gray-haired man named Owen, climbed out, shook my hand, looked at the survey stakes we'd set the evening before, and simply said, "We'll stay exactly on your property line." That was all I needed to hear. Within minutes, the water lines were connected, safety barriers were in place, and the first blade touched the concrete with a high-pitched scream that echoed through Franklin Ridge like somebody had hit a giant tuning fork. Lights came on inside houses all around us. Curtains moved. Garage doors cracked open just enough for curious eyes to peek through. It didn't take long before Richard's SUV came flying around the corner. He jumped out before the vehicle had completely stopped, waving his arms as he marched toward the crew. "Stop," he shouted. "This is HOA property." Owen didn't even look up from the paperwork in his hands. He calmly pointed toward the survey, then toward the permit packet and county correspondence clipped neatly together. "Sir," he replied, "our contract covers private property owned by Mr. Walker. If you believe otherwise, you're welcome to contact county code enforcement. Until then, my crew is working under licensed supervision." Richard turned toward me with a look somewhere between disbelief and outrage. "You're seriously doing this?" he snapped. I took a sip of coffee before answering. "No, Richard, you did this 3 weeks ago. I'm just cleaning it up." For a second, I thought he might keep arguing, but then another county vehicle pulled up. An inspector stepped out carrying a clipboard, introduced herself, and asked to review the documentation I'd submitted. She measured the property markers, compared them with the recorded survey, walked the length of the fresh sidewalk, then quietly nodded. Richard tried explaining that the project benefited the community, but she stopped him with one simple question. Did you obtain authorization before placing concrete on privately owned land? He opened his mouth and closed it again. That Simon said more than any speech ever could. The saw started back up, sending a fine mist of water into the morning air as the blade carved a perfectly straight line exactly along the property boundary. There was no revenge in it, no reckless destruction, just precise, professional work correcting a mistake that should never have happened. Section by section, the crew lifted the unauthorized concrete away, loaded it onto the trailer, cleaned every loose fragment, and reshaped the edge of my driveway until it looked as though the obstruction had never existed. By lunchtime, my truck rolled out of the garage for the first time in nearly a week. I remember pausing at the end of the driveway, looking back once before pulling onto the street, feeling lighter than I had in days. It wasn't because I'd won. It was because I hadn't allowed someone else's confidence to rewrite the boundaries of my own property. A month later, the association's insurance carrier began asking questions the board clearly hadn't expected. Legal invoices, contractor bills, engineering reports, debris removal, inspection fees, permit costs, and corrective construction all found their way back to the HOA's budget. Homeowners weren't happy when they learned why thousands of dollars had disappeared from the reserve fund over one unnecessary decision. Richard resigned before the end of the summer. Nobody threw him a farewell party. Nobody even seemed surprised. At the first meeting under the new board, one of the directors stood up and announced that every future construction project affecting private property would require written owner approval and independent survey verification before work could begin. I didn't clap. I didn't make a speech. I simply signed the attendance sheet and went home, because that policy wasn't a favor to me. It was something that should have existed from the beginning. Every now and then, someone driving through the neighborhood asks why one section of sidewalk looks slightly different from the rest. The neighbors who remember usually smile before saying, "That's the spot where somebody forgot the difference between managing a community and owning somebody else's land." They're right. Rules can help a neighborhood, but only when they're backed by respect instead of ego. The moment people in power convince themselves that good intention excuse ignoring another person's rights, they're already headed toward trouble. Looking back, I don't hate Richard. I honestly think he became so convinced he was improving the neighborhood that he stopped seeing the people who actually lived there. That's a dangerous habit no matter where you are. So now I'm curious what you think. If you walked outside one morning and found your own driveway sealed shut by fresh concrete because somebody decided they knew better than you, what would you have done? Would you have fought it the same way, hired a lawyer immediately, or just accepted it to keep the peace? Let me know down in the comments, because stories like this always seem to divide people right down the middle. And if you enjoy real neighborhood disputes, property battles, and moments where patience ends up being stronger than anger, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next story.